Hello, my name is Julie, and today I'm going to be predicting the 2024 Goodreads Choice Awards nominees for fantasy using only Goodreads. I'm a longtime Goodreads user, longtime fantasy fan. I always love every year getting the chance to vote in the Goodreads Choice Awards, finding out what has been the most popular fantasy of the year, and sometimes finding out some new titles that I've never heard of and giving them a shot. Of course, it's a popularity contest, so who's gonna win is kind of decided ahead of time, but I love finding out what books are gonna be nominated. So I thought this year I would do my best to try to predict what the books are going to be. And to do that, I used Goodreads itself to try to figure out what books are they mentioning the most, are they pushing the most, and which ones Goodreads users are talking about and rating the highest. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how the Goodreads Choice Awards works, then my methodology, and then some books that I don't think are going to get nominated because of one reason or another, and then the actual books that are going to get nominated. So you can use the chapters below if you would like to skip around to what you would like to see, because I am going to go about my methodology for a bit because I worked so hard on this. So if you do want to skip to just what books I think are going to be nominated, you can go to this timestamp right here. The Goodreads Choice Awards are a People's Choice Awards held through late November to early December of every year. It's based on a popular vote of Goodreads users. The users do not have to have read any book in any category to vote in any category. In the last couple of years, how it has worked is that there are 20 nominees in each category. People vote, the list gets down to 10, people vote again, and that's how we pick our number one. It is generally the most popular books of the years that are nominated, but the nominees are picked by the Goodreads editors who have statistics that we don't have access to. And they have said that they are trying to bring a mix of like quantity and quality metrics together to pick those top 20. Other than that, we don't really know what goes on in exactly what they pick, but we do have our eligibility rules. Number one, the book has to be published between November 16th, 2023 and November 12th, 2024 in English in the US. Translations can count, and re-releases can count if they are considered, quote, significant. 2, the book must have a 3.50 average rating at the time of the Goodreads Choice Awards. Number 3, a book may qualify only for one genre category. And number 4, only one book in a series can qualify for the awards. The last big thing we need to take into account when talking about the fantasy awards is last year they debuted the fantasy romance category. This was kind of controversial, but I thought it was a good move. I think that they are kind of separate enough groups of readers that they kind of should have their own category. I completely disagree with them getting rid of categories like they did last year. I think they should really only be adding categories. Based on articles that I've seen on Goodreads and like the popularity of those books and genres, I am going to operate as if the fantasy romance category is still in place. When I do my picks, if they end up being the same category, I will only count against myself the books that are fantasy and not fantasy romance. I will just pretend those books don't exist to score myself. Those are all the rules we have to follow. Let me talk about my methodology. So as I mentioned before, I decided to use only Goodreads to figure out what books to put on my list. There are 3 kinds of lists that Goodreads puts out that I used. One, there are the articles or listicles that they put out regularly that are on their blog page. This way, we should be able to see the biases of the editors who are actually putting the list together. Number 2, there's Listopia, which used to be a really popular part of Goodreads, but not anymore. But there are a couple of well-established lists that are still used, specifically the Can't Wait Sci-Fi Fantasy of X year, so we can see what people are actually voting for. And number 3, there are the generated lists by Goodreads, specifically the new releases section of Goodreads, which became kind of invaluable. When you go on new releases on Goodreads, it shows you new releases from authors you've read, but you can actually go over to the overall most popular books, and you can see how many times the book has been shelved. I didn't see that you could see how many times it was shelved until literally last week. I have been working on this for months. So we can objectively see how many people are interested in each of these books. So I ended up pulling from 12 different lists that I considered to be significant enough or like the lists that were specifically about 2024 releases and their quality, including any fantasy romance or young adult titles, just to get as many books as I could, and I ended up with a total of 148 books. From there, I put in on this spreadsheet a ton of different statistics about the different books. I am not going to run through every book, but I will give you all my little pie charts about the different statistics to kind of give you a range of what we're looking at. So first off, we need to eliminate any books that aren't going to be published within the time. So there were 8 books that were 2024 releases that were not published within time to be nominated. Next up, we're going to eliminate the books that are definitely going to be in the YA category, and I found 22 of those, so we're down to 118. Then we eliminate the books that are definitely going to be another genre, and I came up with exactly 99 adult fantasy titles, which means we have 99 books to pick 20 out of. So here's some things that I wrote down about them to try to pick. First of all, how many lists of the 12 did I find these books on? Over 50% of the books were only mentioned on one list, but there are some that were mentioned on more than half. Then we have the month that the book was released in. This is relevant because the more recently a book has been nominated, the more that we can just throw out the number of readers that are interested in it because they haven't had time to read it. And Goodreads still ends up nominating books that are recent releases. Then we can look at the series standing. So we have over half of the books are at this moment considered to be standalones. We have a good amount of first books in series and just as many sequels. If the book is a sequel, I wanted to look at if the previous book in the series had been nominated, and that's what this graph looks like. A lot of these were not. Then we have if the author has been nominated for the Goodreads Choice Awards before. There are 2 books that are by authors who have won the awards before. There are several from people who have been nominated, and even some people who were nominated for other Goodreads Choice Awards, but not the fantasy. Just over a third of the books that are qualifying are by debut authors. Then we have the average rating of the book. So of course, some of these books are not out yet, so I'm not counting their rating. There are 8 books that were under a 3.5, which means they have been disqualified for the awards, but 40% of the books have a 4.0 or above. Then we have the number of ratings that the book has had. So the number of people who have marked the book as read. I separated this out on a logarithmic scale. Each of these slices is twice as many readers as the previous slice, and we actually see a pretty good distribution here. Our biggest chunk is between 2,500 and 5,000, but we have some books that have exceeded 20K, even though they only came out this year. And if we want to look at those 2 statistics together, I made this dot plot, which is going to show us how the average rating and the number of ratings have interacted with each other. Again, that y-axis is on a logarithmic scale. Here's some lines in the dot plot to orient you. The dark green line means the book has been disqualified if it's to the left of it. The next vertical green line, I think, means that it won't be nominated, but it won't be disqualified. And the horizontal green line, I think it has enough readers to be a very solid nominee. So we can look at this as like the disqualified, unlikely, and safe bet zones. And just for fun, here are some of the most notable books of the year put onto that graph. So we have The Atlas Complex being one of the worst rated books I've ever seen in my life, and it's the 3rd book of a series. That's crazy how low of a rating it has. There are a good number of like the most talked about books of the year that are in that really low average rating area, but aren't disqualified. And then we have our most popular books of the year all around that upper right quadrant. Then I also wanted to see, had I read that book or that author before? 8 of the books on my list of 99 I have read. 10 of them I have read from a previous book in that series before. 11 of them I have not read from that series or read that book, but I've read the author, and 70 of the people I had not read from that author before. I also did a good amount of research into past years of the Goodreads Choice Awards to see where more of our boundaries are. So the Goodreads Choice Awards kind of changed itself around like 2020 and 2021. It was kind of shifting away from some things. And I learned a good number of takeaways from studying the last years. I got 6 things to mention. Number one, of the 13 years of the awards, only 8 authors have ever won the award, and every single one of those authors, with the exception of one, in my opinion, was a household name or a big enough person in the book sphere that this book being awarded was not the first popular book that they had. The person who I think isn't this is Madeline Miller with Circe winning. The Song of Achilles is a popular book, but it became popular at the same time as Circe. Every other one of the people who have won the award is a mega famous author. So we know the person who's going to win it is a super famous person. It's not going to be somebody new. Number two, sequels, whether that meant direct sequels or companions, have gone down by 50%. 6 years ago, even through 2020, sequels would make up about half of the Goodreads Choice Awards nominees, and now they are only 25%. And this has stayed consistent even if we only have a couple years to go off of. Not only that, possibly the biggest takeaway is that there are very few, if any, sequels that have been nominated if the previous book in the series was not nominated. The only time I could find that happening was with the Wayward Children series, and that was book 1 and book 3 were nominated. We're now on book 9. We've not had another book come up. This is such a strong trend that I have fully eliminated any sequel that I think is in that category. The thing about winners that I thought was interesting is that there is a strong bias against high fantasy. If you remove the fantasy romance books that have won the award, there is only one high fantasy book that has won the award, and that is A Dance of Dragons in the first year of the awards. That means the winner is likely to be an established name in fantasy writing a low fantasy book, aka a book set on Earth. And that is likely because people who are not fantasy readers are more likely to read it and give it their vote, rather than trying out a high fantasy title. My next two were also pretty important. Number 5, I've kind of alluded to this before, there is no lower limit to the number of readers a book has to have to get nominated. We know this because in 2022, The World We Make by N.K. Jemisin came out like 1 or 2 weeks before the awards, and it only had 700 readers on the day of the awards. I checked this with the Wayback Machine. This means that they actually do take into account if a newer book hasn't had time to get the readers yet. So I can't actually set a lower limit. Number 6, even though there is the lower limit of 3.5 average rating, I looked at the average ratings over the last 3 years of books. I looked at today's rating, and any book that had less than a 3.7 currently, I went on the Wayback Machine to see what the rating was as close as I could get to the Goodreads Choice Awards. And I found this. In the last 3 years, which kind of was a reshaping of the Goodreads Choice Awards, there have been 0 books in between a 3.5 and a 3.6 at the time of the awards that were nominated. In 2021, there were 2 books that had between a 3.6 and a 3.7, but there were none in 2022 and 2023. The lowest that you get for 2022 and 2023 was in that 3.7 to 3.8 range. So I think it's a really safe bet to say that anything below a 3.7 isn't going to be nominated. So now that I've talked about all my methodology and the work I've put into this, I'm going to talk about a bunch of books that I think won't be nominated and why. Number 1, the ratings. Here are the books that have been disqualified from the Goodreads Choice Awards because of their low rating below a 3.5. Here are the books that I do not think will be nominated because they are lower than a 3.7. Let's talk about because of re-releasing. There are 3 fantasy titles that have had re-releases this year. All of them were originally indie published and are now becoming traditionally published in 2024. I think 2 of them could be considered 2024 releases, but one of them I do not think will be, and that is The Sunlit Man by Brandon Sanderson. I only found one place on Goodreads that this was considered a 2024 release. Everywhere else it was considered 2023, especially because if this was considered to be a 2024 release, it would be the 3rd most read book of the year and one of the highest rated. I had it on my little dot graph earlier. I don't think Goodreads is considering this a 2024 release, so I'm not. Then there's because of genre. These are all of the books that I think are going to be considered fantasy romance instead of fantasy. Anything else, I kept on the fantasy list just in case. Then there's a couple of books by authors that are nominees of the Goodreads Choice Awards, but they have released short story collections. I haven't seen short story collections be nominated in fantasy in a while, if at all. And then the last and most shocking category is the sequels category. I do not think that any book that series has skipped a book will be nominated. That means we are not going to see Tasha Suri on this list. We're not going to see John Gwynne or Richard Swan or Jay Kristoff, despite them having pretty big fandoms behind those series. So here is a list of sequels that I don't think are going to be on the list. I was shocked when some of these books had to be eliminated because I feel like I hear people talk about them all the time. Now I can finally talk about what books that I think will qualify. I have picked 20 and I am going to kind of play a game with myself. I am going to end up reacting to the Goodreads Choice Award nominations and probably do a vlog, but I would like to play a game with myself to see if I win with my predictions. First of all, I'd like for all 20 of the actual nominees to be on my spreadsheet of 148 books. 2, I'd like to have 12 of 20 correct. 3, I'd like 8 of the top 10 to be in my top 20. I haven't numbered mine. So let me talk about the most obvious books that are going to be on the list, in my opinion. Number 1, the most obvious pick for the Goodreads Choice Awards nominees this year is The Familiar by Leigh Bardugo. This is far and away the most read fantasy book of the year. It has over 70,000 ratings on Goodreads, even though it only came out this year, and it has beat the second place book by over 20,000 ratings. That is by far more than most books ever get read. It is the most shelved fantasy book of this year by 100,000 readers. It is tied for the most mentioned book of the year, being on the most lists that I found. And the nail in the coffin is that Leigh Bardugo has won the award for adult fantasy 2 times with her 2 other adult fantasy titles. So she has never lost this award. However, it is tied for the worst rated book she's ever written. Her debut novel has a 3.81, and this book that came out this year has a 3.81, and it is only going to get lower. I have seen over the weeks of doing the research for this rating just tank. It is going to become her worst rated book. So I am going to be massively disappointed if this book actually wins. I will not be surprised when it wins, but I don't want it to because even Leigh Bardugo fans don't like it that much. This is set during the Spanish Inquisition. Our main character is a maid who finds out she has a little bit of magic, and her mistress starts kind of exploiting her for that. I read this book, I gave it a 3-star. I did not think there was anything to write home about. The historical setting of the Spanish Inquisition was kind of the only thing this book had going for it. If this doesn't win, I will be shocked. I just don't think there is one big heavy hitter to really knock this off the spot. Then the next 7 books that I'm going to talk about are on 2 lists at the same time. They are both on the most read books of the year, and they are on the highest rated books of the year above 4,000 reviews. That means they have both the quantity and the quality to back them up. So the second most popular fantasy book of this year is Somewhere Beyond the Sea by T.J. Klune. This is the sequel to The House on the Cerulean Sea, which got 3rd place in the Goodreads Choice Awards when it was nominated. And I would argue that this book has only become more popular after it was in the awards. So I think that there is more of a fan base to vote for it this year than the last time it was nominated. T.J. Klune also, the following year, got 2nd place for Under the Whispering Door. The first book in this series is about a home for dangerous magical children, and a social worker is coming to investigate them. It's queer and there's a love story. So this is the 2nd most shelved book of the year. It is like 4th or so place in most read books of the year, but it just came out. so it is rapidly approaching going to become that second most read. It is the highest rated book, above 15,000 reviews, so there is just a lot behind it. If something is going to dethrone Leigh Bardugo, I think it's going to be this. Book number 3, currently the second most read fantasy book of the year, is Emily Wilde's Map of the Otherlands. Emily Wilde is about a scientist of fairies. She's trying to put together her encyclopedia, and she has to work with her academic rival to do so, even though he drives her nuts. It is in the top 10 most mentioned books of the year, and the previous book last year was nominated in the fantasy category and came in 4th place behind some heavy hitters. That's like as good as you can ask for like a first-time author of the awards. Then number 4, I have The Tainted Cup by Robert Jackson Bennett. This is in those 2 lists that I mentioned and also in the top 10 most mentioned books of the year. The author has previously been nominated for the award with Foundry Side. He's got several series that have kind of accrued him some following. It also has appeal outside of the fantasy genre, with plugging itself as a Sherlockian fantasy mystery. Personally, I gave this a 3-star. I thought the fantasy elements of this book were really, really cool, but I thought the mystery part was actually lacking. Book number 5 is The Book of Doors by Gareth Brown. I keep wanting to call him Gareth Bryn after the guy from Wheel of Time. This is on that top 10 most read, top 10 highest rated over 4K, although it is more read than Tainted Cup and has a lower rating than Tainted Cup, but it is mentioned just about as much as Tainted Cup. These two are kind of been talked about in tandem a lot. It is very popular outside of the genre because it is a low fantasy book. It's mostly set in New York. This has to do with a girl who comes across a book that can make a door become any door. And it has been compared to Addie LaRue and Matt Haig, which is kind of giving it that market's fantasy book of the year. So this is one of the few debut authors I have on this list, and I think is going to do pretty well in the awards. Personally, I give this a 3-star. I was more interested in the first half of the book than the second half of the book. I don't know, there was just something missing. Something felt off to me about it that just didn't really work for me in a way I couldn't quite explain. Obvious book number 6 is The Warm Hands of Ghosts. Again, it's on that top 10 and the top highest rated. It's also in the top most mentioned. The author has been nominated before. Even though the Winter Night trilogy wrapped up years ago, it is still like a staple of the bookish community and people recommend it all the time. So this was a really, really anticipated book going into this year. I actually read this as an arc. I thought this was really great. I gave it like a 4.5. This is a historical fantasy about siblings during World War I trying to find each other again, and I thought it was great. This is gonna have cross-genre appeal because while it does have the fantastical element, I would argue it's more historical than fantastical. I would still say it is a fantasy book, but I think the historical element is more emphasized and would bring in more readers. Number 7, I believe The Black Bird Oracle by Deborah Harkness is going to get nominated. This is in the top 10 most read, top 10 highest rated above 4K. You could kind of question if this is going to be in fantasy or fantasy romance. You could also kind of say about this being a sequel. So there was the original All Souls trilogy starting with A Discovery of Witches. The 3rd book in the series won the Goodreads Choice Awards for fantasy, like the 2nd or 3rd year of the awards. Later, there was like a prequel book that came out that wasn't nominated, but to me, that kind of doesn't count because that was a prequel. This one has been marketed as a direct sequel to the trilogy, so I'm saying that this is still in qualification. And of course, she's already won the award, so I think it not being nominated would be kind of strange. And the last book that I think is an obvious shoo-in for the awards is The Spell Shop by Sarah Beth Durst. This is in the top 10 most read books of the year and highest rated above 4K. The Spell Shop is about a librarian whose city is sacked, and so she saves a ton of books and escapes to her island where she grew up. But the thing is that having those books is actually illegal, like only the Empire is supposed to have them, but the Empire has just been attacked by rebels. It turns out that the island is dying because the Empire has not been sending mages to fix the island, but it's illegal for anybody else to do magic. So she is kind of having to figure out if she is going to help people or not because she could be killed for it. The major question here is it going to be fantasy or fantasy romance. Looking at the marketing of this book, I think it would have you believe it is a fantasy romance book. However, I have read this book, and I think it's more of a fantasy book. I think it is more in line with Legends and Lattes and Emily Wilde and Tress of the Emerald Sea that have been nominated for fantasy rather than fantasy romance. I mean, just kind of looking at this cover, this does not look like it would fit in with the other fantasy romance titles. Even though it is published under Bramble, which is specifically supposed to be a sort of fantasy romance imprint, it's not even like closed door. Like the relationship doesn't get that far because it is a subplot of the book, rather than being like 50% of the focus, like a lot of fantasy romance were. I also adored this book. This is my perfect cozy fantasy. I cannot stop talking about it. I wish I had bought this book before reading it. And at this point in time, this is going to be my vote for the awards. Now we get a step away from what I think is the super obvious, and these are the things that I think are good bets. Number 9, I have picked 5 Broken Blades by Mai Cortland. This is an Asian-inspired fantasy where we have 5 assassins who are like lone wolves who have been hired to work together to kill one mark. It is in the top 10 most read fantasy books of the year, but it is only in that 3.8 range. It is really high in the number of people who have shelved this book, and that is likely because this was a Book of the Month pick. Book of the Month helps bring in a bunch of people who aren't necessarily fantasy readers to the fantasy genre, and we're gonna see a couple more of those books on here because it has brought so many people to it. Then number 10, we have A Sorceress Comes to Call by T. Kingfisher. I actually quite want to read this book. This was in the top 10 highest rated over 4K, but it just missed the top 10 most read. It did come out a little bit later in the year, so it has some time, and it is in the top 10 most mentioned books of the year. The author has been nominated multiple times for the Goodreads Choice Awards across both fantasy and horror, and I feel like T. Kingfisher has a really solid group of fans at this point. Number 11 is a little bit of a hopeful one for me. I don't know if I am just being biased in putting this on my list, but I think that Goodreads really would be missing out if they did not include this book, and that is Blood Over Brighthaven by M.L. Wong. This is one of the re-releases of this year. So this was originally indie published at least a year ago, and it was traditionally published in October of this year. This is the 3rd highest rated book on the list, period. It is the highest rated book that I believe is qualified for the award. So the 2 books that were ahead of it are a sequel that will not get nominated because the previous book was not nominated, and the other one was a book with under 300 readers. So it is the highest rated qualified book. It having a higher readership is a little bit about it being indie published first, and it does have lower shelvings than a lot of the books that I put on this list, but I think Goodreads should be taking into account the fact that this is so highly rated, and it is just shy of 9,000 readers. So this is a fantasy dark academia about a main character going to a magical school. And I have heard only fantastic things. It has over a 4.4, which is pretty hard to do. They could disqualify it for not being a significant enough re-release, but has been advertised as a 2024 release. I think it won't be disqualified. If it is not on the list, I am going to be a little bit mad. You can't say that you're about quality if you don't put the highest quality book on the list. Book number 12 is The Bright Sword by Lev Grossman. This is a Camelot type book. Our main character shows up to Camelot and things are not what he expected them to be. So Lev Grossman wrote the Magician series, which is very popular. It was made into a TV show. I did not even hear of this book until it was already released, but now I've been seeing quite a few people talk about it, and I think it'll be a good nominee. It just missed that highest rated over 4K. It's got like a 4.0 something. Number 13, we've got A Song to Drown Rivers. So this is another one of those Book of the Month picks. It is one of the more mentioned books of the year. It honestly had a lot of ad presence on Goodreads. I got advertisements for this book. This is inspired by one of the 4 beauties of China. So it's a historical fantasy, mythological thing. Not only is it a Book of the Month pick, but it was a Good Morning America pick. And I just have seen a lot of industry hype behind this book. It has over a 4 in rating, It has a good amount of readership, but it did just come out. So this does have a good amount of shelves that have not turned into readers yet. And having that myth thing is actually a pretty good shot of it being nominated. Next up, we have When Among Crows by Veronica Roth. Again, kind of unsure about this one. Veronica Roth, of course, is the author of Divergent, super popular back in the day. And she's released a couple of books. I believe she has been nominated for the Goodreads Choice Awards since. I think she was nominated in sci-fi. This is an urban fantasy that has to do with like monster hunters and the Baba Yaga. It's a novella. So this feels like interesting flavor. Also, I am obsessed with this cover. But this has a pretty low rating. This is a 3.72. So it could not be nominated, but having above a 3.7 is not enough for me to disqualify it, and it just missed the most read books of the year. She has a good amount of following that this will be on a lot of people's radars, but I don't think it's really going to be up there. Then I have Voyage of the Damned by Frances White, I believe. This is one of the top 10 most mentioned books of the year, mostly for it making a lot of lists about it being a debut novel. Queer Titanic fantasy is what I got out of it. It's advertising itself as if Agatha Christie wrote a fantasy book. Because of that, it'll have a lot of cross-genre appeal. Despite it coming out fairly recently, it did have a boost to its numbers on Goodreads because it was released in the UK before it was released in the US. So I don't know if that'll affect things, help, hurt, but I think that this will be a good pick to have like another debut novel on here because I think this is one of the few. Now we move into the super unsure category. All of these books I waffled on for a long time and I did not solidify as my picks until today, after doing this project for months now. But next up I have The Foxwife, which is yet another Book of the Month pick. I did not even know that this was a fantasy book, even though I had seen it on Book of the Month. This is about a woman who is found dead and the village around her believes that the fox spirits of the area have something to do with the death. This did just miss the top 10 most read, so it has over 10,000, so it is a good fit there. Me not putting it on here was me just not associating it with a fantasy title. Like, do fantasy fans know about this? But maybe that means that there's cross-genre appeal, that it's going to get outside of the fantasy community votes. Next up, we have A Dark and Drowning Tide by Allison Saft. So Allison Saft actually has 2 books that could qualify for this award, but this is the much more shelved and anticipated book of hers. Yeah, I read her other one. I gave it like a 3. But this is one of the more mentioned books of the year. This does, again, have a lower rating. This has a 3.76 at the moment. But it is a recent release that has a lot of shelvings for it. Now, I'm quite unsure about this one. Number 18, I have put The Book That Broke the World by Mark Lawrence. The Book That Wouldn't Burn last year was nominated for the Goodreads Choice Awards. It did not make the top 10, which sort of makes me question if it's going to get nominated. But if I don't have it on here, that means we're not going to have as many sequels on this list as we have had the last couple of years. I don't know if it should be on here. But this author is kind of a staple of the Goodreads Choice Awards. I can't eliminate this book. It doesn't have as many readers as some of the books on this list, but I think a lot of people who have read it would definitely vote for it because they liked both books. Then we have The Night Ends with Fire by KX Song. This is a Mulan retelling that has been said it has fantasy and romance in it. I have gotten a lot of ads for this book. And I am genuinely interested in it, except it has like a 3.81. It came out this summer. It doesn't have a huge amount of readers, but it has a lot of people shelving it, so I think that ad campaign did really work. And I think, again, it being a mythology book kind of gives it a little bit of an edge that it'll get some people reading it. Hey, it's me from later. I had already filmed this video, but I have decided to change my 20th pick, and that is to The Lost Story by Meg Schaefer. This is a Narnia-inspired story about 2 boys who go missing for several years and come back and seem to be like very well kept. So it is a portal fantasy, So there is a little bit of debate. Is this magical realism or is it fantasy? Last year, Meg Schaefer was nominated for the fiction category for her book The Wishing Game, which is safely a magical realism. It was considered fantasy by things like Book of the Month, but considered fiction by Goodreads, and it got like 3rd place or something in the awards. I thought that that's what happened here, but Goodreads actually has listed its #1 genre as fantasy. And you know what? I would not have pigeonholed this author into the fiction category had this book shown up on any Goodreads editor list. This showed up on the most popular books of the year list that shows up every month, but not any Goodreads editor list. And that's strange because this book is read so much. This has 19,000 reviews, which puts it at like around the top 5 mark for most read fantasy book of the year. And the next book that we see that is only on one list is An Education in Malice, which is at like the number 20 most read spot. I have no doubt in my mind that this book is going to be nominated for the Goodreads Choice Awards. I don't know if it's going to be considered more fiction, and I'm not sure what the process is of deciding what genre a book is going to be in. Like, do the authors or the marketing teams of the book have any say in what genre they want to put it for? Are they going to put books in the category that they think it has the greatest chance of winning? Or is it supposed to be what matches the book's genre the best? I think it is a safer bet for me to put this book on the list than a book that I'm not sure has enough readership or eyes on it to get onto the awards at all. Let me know what you think about this book in the comments, because I think that this is one of the big 50-50s of the year. But that means I have given you all 20 of my nominees for the Goodreads Choice Awards. I don't necessarily agree with that these should be the picks, but based on my meticulous research over the course of months, I believe that these are as close as I could possibly get. I think if anything else gets chosen over any of these books, it'll be slightly breaking a trend that I've seen in the past. So definitely let me know what you think is gonna be on the Goodreads Choice Awards. What did I get right? What do you think I'm gonna get wrong? So keep your eyes peeled, because I am definitely going to be reacting to the books that make the Goodreads nominees, and I am planning on reading some of them to better inform my vote and vlog that. So if you'd like to catch that, you should definitely subscribe down below and maybe hit that bell. And if you'd like to find me anywhere else on the internet, you can find me at the link in the description to everything I do. Thank you so much for watching this very long and rambly video. I have been working so hard on this. This project has been my baby for months, so I really want to get it right. I don't know that I will, but I've tried my best. Thank you again for watching, and as always, I will see you in the next one.